So, house rules are not for everyone, I know that. And I can't take full credit for these. There was initially two of us that did, we came up with these house rules. And then Paul joined in later on and helped to sort of finalise them and get them where they are. We're probably on about version 3 or 4 or somewhere there. Now, a lot of people have asked me for these house rules and I've sent them over. They've had questions about it. And some people hate them. That's fine. Each to their own. As I said before, we use the JTS engine as a sort of a tabletop, and we've come up with these rules to enjoy it. Why not? Okay, and if you don't like them, you don't like them. Don't use them. Don't use them. That's fine. If you like them and want to use them, by all means, get in touch. It's absolutely fine. But just to clarify for the other players that are in this game at the minute, and I suppose anybody else that's using these rules, I just want to go over them. So we got some standard house rules and we got some additional campaign house rules, and the additional campaign house rules could be adjusted for sort of Yenos and Ekmals and things like that, but of course we're playing the Waterloo one, so we've adjusted them and fine-tuned them for Waterloo. So the first house rule that we got is stacking. While using road movement is prohibited, with the exception of artillery and supply wagons, who may stack with an infantry or cavalry unit. This means that one unit per road hex or path hex to simulate an army being strung out on the march. There must also be one clear road hex between each marching unit to simulate congestion and an order of march for all units with the exception of artillery and wagons. This sounds very laborious, but in essence it means that if you're marching infantry on a road or path or something like that, you've got to have one hex behind the next marching unit, if that makes sense. So if you had 1,000 men in a stack, or a regiment or something like that, you have to have them on a road hex and behind them one clear road hex, because that's kind of, you have to use your imagination. You've got 500 men in that hex and 500 men in the hex behind. You get used to it. Cavalry can stack with other cavalry up to 300, but we'll go with that later. And they can stack with guns, and they can stack with supply columns as well. They're sort of exempt from that rule. So marching has to be one clear hex in general between infantry. In towns, villages, chateaus, or any type of building, infantry can only be in column or skirmisher formation. The same applies for forest or any other type of obstructed hex, woods and copses, plantations, vineyards, etc. JTS, Rich, if you're listening, has no open order formation. Therefore, in terms of firepower, we thought that column would be the closest. Line was a bit too much. It wouldn't represent a realistic amount of firepower, too much firepower. Therefore, the only troops that can be in line are light troops and no more than 250 strong as well. Skirmishers, of course, can go in as well. So it was a bit of a compromise when we went around and did that. And yeah, so infantry have to be in column in a town or a village or a forest or something like that. However, if they're light troops, they can go in line as a bit of a compromise, providing they are no more than 250 strong. Don't forget, you can break them down with skirmishers to get that 250. Cavalry operated in squadrons, don't care what anybody else says, even if they're present on the field as one regiment. Cavalry is always to be broken down to squadron level, with a maximum of 200 per squadron. Depends which book you read, anywhere between 180 and 100 to 200. For these games, such as Campaign Waterloo, where all the cavalry is in regiments, on the very first turn, or as soon as they arrive on the field, the very first thing you've got to do is break them down into squadrons with no more than 200 horse per squadron. Maximum 300 cavalrymen should be in any one hex. This allows for the realistic spacing in formations. We did quite a lot of research into this, and this is the approximate physical limits of that space in that hex. As with all rules, common sense should be used. You do get a plus 5% variance just because of the way squadrons break down and the numbers, etc. Therefore, a player could have as much as 315 cavalry in any one hex, but never more than that. If the stacking rule is broken, if you charge or there's a retreat or something like that, then you have to make every attempt on the next turn to get that stack back into an acceptable level. Artillery, maximum of 8 guns may occupy any single hex at one time. Any more than that, they'd have to extend. One infantry or cavalry unit can also occupy the same hex as the guns, because it's assumed that the guns are deployed in the forward portion of the hex with the support unit behind. Fairly self-explanatory, that one. Maximum amount of infantry in a hex is limited to 1,300 men. Unit of more than 800 must always assume extended line formation when in line. 2 units of 650 men could be in the same hex, but because we would assume that one is behind the other. Fairly straightforward, that one. Whenever stacking rules are broken due to combat, melee, rout, or combination of all, the owning player should attempt to rectify it on their next turn by moving units to bring the stack back to any acceptable level. Night combat is not allowed. It wasn't realistic for maybe 1 or 2 occasions. When visibility drops to 1 hex, all combat should be suspended. If 2 units find themselves facing apart and 1 hex apart, or basically in adjacent hexes, they should both retreat 1 hex. However, if one side is occupying a victory location or a strategic hex, a town or bridge or something like that, they're not obliged to back up, but then the other player would. When both players have stabilised their lines, all forward movement should be stopped until daybreak. Night movement is allowed to reorganise one's unit and establish a new defensive perimeter. Flank march is permissible as long as it is a sideways move and not a push forward. In other words, there's been no advance other than on the flanks, and it's not designed to gain new ground from the enemy nor march to contact. You could argue with scouts, this is a common sense one. You basically have to be able to justify marching. You might come into contact and then you stop. You wouldn't then push and have a big night contact. Skirmisher units were not fully independent, therefore a skirmisher unit can never be more than 4 hexes from their parent unit. In the case where combat or flight has forced them to separate further, the unit should make every effort to bring itself back within the 4 hex rule. This rule does not apply to skirmisher units that are completely independent, such as the Jaeger units, the Prussians and Austrians, etc., or the 95th of the British that were often attached to other formations. So skirmishers, they can't operate too far ahead. We're talking more now with detached skirmish units from line formations rather than light troops and independents. All artillery must be within 4 hexes or up to 10 traced by a road to a supply unit. Artillery units are considered to be carrying enough ammo and caisson for 2 shots. After that, they must be within range of a supply unit to continue firing. Horse artillery is exempt from this rule, we're just assuming that they've got enough with them. In cases where there's not enough supply wagons for the artillery provided, like the Russians, when they have a few supply units for their whole army, the players can adapt this rule with imaginary supply units for every 5 batteries or so. This should be discussed between the players at the time. Any redoubts and fortresses, etc. are exempt from this rule, and they can be deemed to have stockpiled ammunition. Very much rule of thumb, this one. We're trying to simulate supply, so you've got to have a supply wagon there or thereabouts. If you then need to go off and resupply some infantry who are low on ammo, then it's considered that if there's only one supply wagon in the area next to your artillery, they've dumped some shot, they've stockpiled a little bit, and they go off and do that. That's absolutely fine. So it's a very much a spirit of the rule of thumb rule, this one. Skirmishers are very strong in this game. So due to the perceived strength of skirmisher units in the game, no more than 2 skirmisher units may occupy a single hex at any one time. Doesn't matter what size they are. However, you're not allowed more than 2 skirmisher units in a single hex. Leaders can't be used for recon purposes. One that boils my piss, or a very gamey tactic. Neither can they go into deep forays to capture supplies and victory point locations and stuff like that. Due to movement allowance leaders, they could be used in wide flanking movements to go and inspect the rear echelon of an opponent's position. This is prohibited. A leader must be accompanied by a cavalry squadron to attempt any of this kind of manoeuvre. Even then, it wouldn't really be done. It's a very, very gamey tactic. Leaders wouldn't just go off and have rogue missions on their own, capturing supply and victory locations and stuff like that. Just, it's not to be done, full stop. To simulate leadership, a unit must be in command to launch an attack of an opponent unit. For a unit to be in command, it must be within 4 hexes of a leader and its chain of command. For instance, a battalion wishing to melee a unit to its front must be within 4 hexes of its brigadier or divisional corps army commander. ADCs of the army can also fulfil this duty. And we don't play within no detached melee rule, as the purpose of that in the game is simulated within this rule. While we don't play with it, it's a very good rule, but it's a little bit too strict with our house rules, because we make heavy use of scouts, and at times we found that you can't capture bridges or initiate any combat with them or defend with your scouts. So excuse me, we sort of broke that down a little bit. The rules relax for scouts, there we go, that have a designated objective, as they may only act in a limited capacity in terms of offensive actions to achieve their objectives or in defence. A unit that has become disordered can only initiate an offensive melee if a leader is actually stacked with it, although a disrupted unit may still fire. If a leader is not present in the same stack, it cannot melee. If a cavalry unit becomes disrupted, though, during a charge on the second or third, it can still continue to charge. However, if infantry or skirmisher units that are initially undisrupted fail the disruption check, they can't initiate a melee without a leader in the same hex. They weren't machines, basically. They didn't just go on and on and on. There we go, leads me to this very next rule. Continued exposure to trauma would sap a unit's ability to act offensively, due to the fact that casualties among lower level leaders were also higher, battalion that was roughly handled and could find itself without effective leadership. When a unit reaches 40% casualties, don't worry about skirmishers and things like that, it can no longer initiate melee and only act as a defensive force. Units marked as guard, though, are exempt from this rule. The morale experience in units, LAN of such units was so high that it could be made to push on beyond normal limits. So everybody apart from guard has to follow this 40% rule in terms of offensive capacity. Excuse me. A brave display by a leader can often make troops make troops do things that they would not normally do. For this reason, a unit that has broken the 40% casualty threshold may still initiate a melee if a leader is present in the hex and providing they're not disordered. Cavalry had a certain amount of land, so they're exempt from this rule and not limited by the 40% rule. In any case, a depleted cavalry squadron can always be recombined with its parent unit. Just got to remember where the parent unit is, that's my problem. When moving forward into melee, you should always leave an escape route for the defender. All turns should be thought of as happening simultaneously at the same time. Therefore, in reality, a unit could attempt to retreat before being surrounded. This rule is to stop players from playing the game and attempting to blitz their opponent and surround and isolate units. So what happens is you get into a position to, let's say the next turn, go for surrounding a unit, but you've got to leave them an escape route because they need a chance to go out or to get out of that. With the way the game works, you could have 8 units tying down a single unit and that wouldn't have happened either. However, if they don't take that escape route, then you can surround them and destroy them that way. Stop that horrible, blitzy, gamey, unrealistic, unhistoric tactic that some people use. Any unit that finds itself routed and behind enemy lines cannot be used to initiate any combat other than defensive combat. They also cannot be used as scouts or to recapture any VPs. The owning player should endeavour to get the cut-off unit back to their own lines without causing any disruption and in a realistic manner. There's no exceptions to this rule. Another thing that people do that really irritates me, these gamey players that a unit can rally behind an opponent's line, then they capture leaders, then they go and recapture victory points and they capture supply. No. That's not to be done. What you have to do is get them back to your lines, or endeavour to get them back to your lines. Maybe it's through woods and it takes a long time. It's almost like a little side quest in its own right, getting units back. I remember in my last game I had some Prussian troops trying to get back to their lines, trying to avoid scouts and things like that in the woods, crossing rivers by night and trying to get back, and it was a little adventure for them. But please don't, or if they do rally, don't go on a little quest behind lines. Not realistic. Similarly, the fact that cavalry needed space in order to form for a charge, any charge that is initiated must be done with at least one clear hex between you and your intended target. So you can't charge from an adjacent one, you need that single hex in between, or at least one hex in between you. You can still melee from an adjacent hex, though, that's absolutely fine, but you won't get the combat bonus of charging. Due to game limitations with zones of control, namely when attacking with cavalry and the fact that they can be trapped by infantry, infantry defending against cavalry are allowed one single offensive fire during the entire attack. Defensive fire, of course, will remain. We're not playing phase play. The defending infantry should also retreat one hex to allow the cavalry to pass, unless this will compromise a defensive position or line. This is just to try and address the imbalance caused by infantry firepower and cavalry not being able to escape or pass through in the game. Even when you use weak zones of control, the cavalry uses all their movement and they basically get trapped in between squares. It's sort of going on with the allowing one hex to escape kind of rule, that if somebody sets up all these squares, the cavalry can't just turn about or pass through and things like that. They can be decimated, when in fact in real life they could easily wheel away if they're an echelon or something like that. So we've got that rule there. It's within limits. It's fair's fair, basically. On a case-by-case basis, you'll sort of see it at the time. So that's our standard house rules. We also have, as I mentioned, these special campaign rules with our courier system and things like that. So, to simulate the fog of war, as well as the difficulty in handling and manoeuvring large amounts of men over vast areas, we're going to use a courier system, and I'll cover the courier system at the end of this video. Worked well, we've refined it a little bit, added a couple of extra little bits to it, but it did work quite well. If you're playing as a commander, you've got to do your best to only look at the portion of your map the map containing your own troops. This will sometimes be unavoidable when you're using the jump map or you're sort of next to somebody, but please refrain from detailed inspections of your allied forces. There's a certain amount of trust that's got to be maintained in this game to have a decent and fair game. This is to help maintain the fog of war. All commanding officers should strive to put themselves in the shoes of their historical leader and try your best to act the way that the general would have done with the knowledge available to them in that scenario. A bit of role playing here. Get into your little avatar, your character on screen, and just think, would I actually know that in real life? This rule is unenforceable anyway, and the level of trust between players is expected. Ask yourself, would the commander actually be able to see the troops or have information on them? Now, a lot of these rules are unenforceable anyway. Not checking. People make mistakes anyway. God knows I still make mistakes sometimes, and it's not intentional. It's within the spirit of the rules. It happens sometimes. The way you got to think about it, and what we sort of discussed with rule breaking, etc., is if you were to have a court-martial after the game finished, could you justify every action decision you made historically, or within the realms of historical procedures, let's say, and according to the rules? And if you could hold your head up and say, yeah, I did everything I could and maybe made an honest mistake, that's absolutely fine. For two commanders to be able to instantly communicate via email or Zoom or something like that, they have to be located in the same hex. Otherwise, the courier system, see the courier system. Okay, I'll get to that later. We came up with the rule from the last Waterloo we played for Wellington and Blucher going to Genappe to have a little conference. And we said, well, if we do that, we need to be in the same hex. And we could have an hour. And if we were an hour would equate to 1 turn's worth of gameplay. If it was more than that, it would go up to 2 hours, for example, and then we would have 2 hours worth of gameplay before we were allowed to sort of send out our couriers with whatever we send and make a decision based upon what we talked about. See the courier system. That will be at the end of this video. At all times, the commander should do their best to only act upon the knowledge that their commander has. For example, the moment a cavalry scout 30 kilometers away discovers an enemy corps, he should not start moving all his army towards it, because he would not know they're there. Although the scout is aware, and maybe his corps commander is aware, the army commander has no first-hand knowledge of this fact. The courier system must be used to appraise a commander of any development or news. Now, we did say that within 20 kilometers, then we can assume that the corps commander would know, if he is there within that 20 kilometers. Same rule applies for the courier system. The same rules used for the courier system shall apply. When a scout or unit discovers an enemy force or location, he must first report this to his corps commander, or to a commander in charge of some allied units, or if he wanted to the nearest corps commander. As long as the corps commander is within 20 hexes, he's considered to be aware immediately. If for whatever reason the corps commander is further away, then we've got to use the courier system. The corps commander can take whatever steps appropriate with this information as soon as he is made aware at the end of the turn, and scouts cannot send blanket dispatches to all leaders and allies, and the chain of command must be followed. So fairly self-explanatory. Your scouts have to report back to their corps commander. They can't just send it out to everybody, because that wouldn't really be done. We wouldn't know where everybody is. Corps commander would then write a report for the army commander and send that off via courier. The army commander could only act in good faith with this knowledge when he's made aware of it. Beginning of the game, the overall commander can issue one single order for each of his core commanders. These are considered to have been done before the first day, basically your campaign orders. In the case of the French, this would represent how the corps should manoeuvre into Belgium, and in the case of the Allied commanders, it would represent standing orders for the defence of the border. I should have reworded that one really. This is a meeting engagement because it's such a wild card. We don't know where anybody is and who's going to go on attack and who's going to be on defence, etc. But it goes to say that the spirit of this one is just you can issue one single command to your core commanders with what they need to do when they get onto the map. Subsequently, all changes to these standing orders will need to be delivered via the courier and cannot be acted upon until the turn after their delivery. So you receive it turn 15, you can't do anything with that courier message until actually turn 16. We're assuming you receive it at the end of a turn, just before you press save. Orders do not need to be overly complicated, and I thoroughly recommend that. And it should be overly complicated in depth and should allow some flexibility for the man on the ground to accomplish his task with the greatest of ease. Minute detail does not need to be contained for orders, and in general keep them as simple as possible. But they do need to have a certain amount of detail in there so that they can not be too open-ended. There needs to be clear sort of objectives, but you can leave how they do the objective or how they reach their objective and what they do there to a certain level of open-ended interpretation. In general, receiving an order must in all faith try his best to follow them. Even if the situation has changed, if a general receives an order to attack a position and in the meantime the position has been reinforced, for example, you can adjust your commitment to the attack to protect his men, but you couldn't necessarily call it off straight away. We'll come back to that. A general would not send his men on a suicide mission, but would still at least to attempt to follow the spirit of the orders. However, we've got an initiative system, and you can have an initiative roll to see if the commander could go against the received orders. A general wishing to override his orders or do his own thing can do so with a roll on his initiative. It took a brave commander to go against the orders issued by his commander, therefore it was a rare thing at this time period. It could be forgiven if successful, and it could be punished if it wasn't. An army commander can always issue orders to any unit on the map without going via the corps commander. So if somebody's Wellington or Napoleon is marching in and he sees something from another corps that he doesn't like, he can intervene. Rarely, but they could. For example, Wellington can issue orders to a division to attack without the presence of the corps commander, or Napoleon can pull a corps away from a marshal at any time. That's with a bit of caveat, because another rule we've got for the French is that I'm not going to bog down the other two guys with over excessive orders and things like that. They're going to be quite autonomous. Players on the same side can and should ask their allies for the hex location of a certain leader they wish to communicate with, rather than physically searching the map, or use the find leader function. Don't be searching around the map, in other words. As previously stated, a commander may roll for initiative to change his current orders and act independently. So, let's say Ney has orders to march somewhere and defend somewhere, but then he has a perfect opportunity to attack. That's not his orders, so he wants to then attack. He would then have to roll a dice, a d12, for initiative. Every corps commander has been given his own initiative rating, based on the historical commander's ability for independent command and temperament. Cavalry commanders tend to have a higher number, as independent thinking was part of their job description. If a player chooses to use his initiative, he rolls a d12 and compares it to the leader's initiative rating. If the roll is lower, or the number, or his initiative, he can change his orders. If the roll is higher, he's failed, but he can try again the next turn. If the roll is successful, the leader initiative goes down by 1, and each time it's successful goes down, but then it also becomes harder to pass that, because you can't just go and do it each and every single time. All initiative ratings reset at midnight each day. If a leader is successful in changing his orders, he must also send a courier to HQ to register his new orders with his commanding officer and say what I've done and what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, basically. So you'd have to send a courier off back, because things may change then for the commander. Each commander has unlimited use of couriers. In our experience, you rarely have more than maybe 5, 6, maybe once or twice you have more than that out. But don't get worried about the minutiae of how many couriers you've got. We just say they are unlimited in essence. So we'll have a look at the courier system and we'll have a look at the initiative tracker. So the courier system is back from the last time we used it, an Excel spreadsheet. Corps commanders down, and scouts, of course, so have to use it. Turn, these are my standing orders. Obviously, I'm not going to let you see what was in there. But they were sent an hour before gameplay on the 16th of June. Sequential message number, fairly straightforward. All from Napoleon. You input the hex location of wherever your corps commander is. He's off map at the moment, and then to whoever the recipient is. And then the receiver hex, you also put that in there as well. That will calculate a straight line distance. You may have to drag, for example, this box down, as I think I've mentioned before, just a little glitch in the system. Delay roll, you have to go on a D20. You can get a free one on Google if you just put in a 20-sided dice and roll to see what that distance is, just to simulate any courier getting lost, rough ground, wrong turn, that sort of stuff. That will then calculate how many transit turns it will actually take and give you the arrival turn. The transit turns will round it up so that it will tell you which turn that it arrives in. Now it arrives in a turn, but you can't act on it until the next turn. Courier success. This is the new bit that we've added. So we roll the D20 for a delayed roll. And this time we're going to re-roll the D20, and on a 1 it would mean that the courier message is not successful for whatever reason. Courier killed or whatever, got lost or whatever it might be. If you roll a 1, you then re-roll again, and on a 1 to 5, then that would mean that the courier has been captured or defected, or the message is lost to a sympathetic local or something like that. So 1 to 5 for that roll would mean that the courier has lost his message and the allies will receive it, and that would go to the nearest allied unit, let's say. And you have to give up the information that's in there. That's just an extra bit to simulate an extra bit of randomness of variation in the courier system itself. Here you type your message, keep it nice and simple. And then you're only allowed to send that to whoever, that corps commander or your ally or whatever, on the turn that's in the arrival turn section. So that's the courier system. It's back with a little bit of variation. The turn tracker then, put a little bit of flavour on it. We said that these corps commanders and ADCs and chiefs of staff, etc., can go against, let's say, Napoleon's orders or Wellington or Blucher's orders, provided that they roll a d12 and they either have a number that is equal to or lower than their initiative rating. And then by each time that they do that and they're successful, it goes down by 1. So the Prussians have got 1, the Allies have also got 1, as well as the French having 1, of course. And then at midnight, you just reset, and we just move these little counters around just to sort of keep track of everything and who's doing what and who still has initiative or doesn't, for example.